welcome to the Messiantics Podcast, a podcast about all things Messianic Judaism. Each episode, we will be sharing our opinions as we tackle some of the biggest issues in Messianic Judaism. Now here's your hosts, Rabbis Eric, David, Jonathan, and Toby.
Hey everybody, we're glad to be with you again today talking about some Messiantics stuff. And today we're kind of focusing, we're going to have a loose conversation, not so much guided like some of our past ones have been, but we're going to talk a little bit about Messianic synagogues, Messianic congregations within communities, and just our relationships with churches that are around us, and some of the ways we interact and get along, some of the ways we disagree and don't get along, and how those kind of, how we can work on those things, to kind of strengthen our strengths and, cast down our weaknesses and make it to where we have a thriving body of Messiah within our local communities. Like for example, Pensacola has tons of churches. I think someone told me one time, I think Rabbi Eric may have told me that we have the most churches per capita of any city in the United States. I think that's either close to being accurate or accurate. I can't remember per se, so don't quote me on that fully. But Pensacola has a lot of churches, and that's largely due to the Brownsville revival. A lot of churches kind of boomed after that event. But even before that, there's still a lot of churches here, a lot of old churches. So, and we're kind of the first and only real Messianic congregation that has been here for years. And so it's kind of, how is our relationship a bridge between the Jewish community and and Christianity? How are we a bridge between, a Torah observant faith versus a, maybe not? I guess I don't want to say that completely because most Christians keep most of the Torah, in regards to a lot
whether they realize it or not.
Realize it or not. Yeah, it's just some of the major things like Shabbat, the Moedim, Kashrut, snip. Yeah, of course. It's funny though, and we actually had a couple come from. It's always funny, so I'm always aware of when we have circumcisions, because we do the services. People ask us to do the circumcision service. We bring in, we have a local doctor who does the circumcisions for us, Dr. Lyle, pro-life doc, and he's great. But we've had people come in from churches who don't attend here at all. Like, we have no tie to us at all. They just know we're Messianic synagogue, and for some reason they believe that circumcision still has some kind of theological...
Some sort of validity,
Some validity, to it. And they're like solid... Baptist, solid Reformed, so not the Baptist, because Reformed would kill me for saying Baptist or Reformed. So we're gonna, we've had Reformed people, we've had Baptists, we've had people from non-Messianic, not even really church-going people come and do it. So it's
we had a couple in our synagogue in New York that were devout Roman Catholic, like mass every single day of the week, but they were also devout Messianic. And I mean, like Father Chazel and everything, like very
Shomer Shabbos,
very intentional. And so they would come to service on Saturdays at the Messianic synagogue, carrying like this pile of books. Some of them were like Catholic resources, some of them were Messianic, some of them were Jewish resources, whatever. But they brought this pile of things with them every week, and would sit through the message, and like they're digging through everything. They're like taking notes. They're doing research on what was being. I mean, it was crazy. Yeah. But I mean, they're really cool people. They were nice.
I think it was recently I was reading about that. There's entire segments of Jewish Catholics who are like you. If you didn't know they went to Mass. Like during the week or on Sunday, you would not be able to tell them apart from like modern day Orthodox. Yeah. Like they're very observant.
Well, and that's the thing that's interesting is it seems like every year or so I learn of a new quote unquote Sabbatarian Christian group. Yeah. Like, obviously there's Seventh-day Adventists and all of that, and then you've got your there's some like weird ones out there. And then you've got like we had a lady come into CMC for about 6 months or so who was from Jamaica, and she was getting ready to go back home. She lived in our area and was coming to CMC before she went home, who was Seventh-day Baptist is the denomination back in that she was part of back in Jamaica. I'd never heard of. Did some research. Come to find out, it's a big thing. And then there's like, there are some Sabbatarian Pentecostal groups out there, and there are Sabbatarian Catholics. There are. I mean, it's nuts. I didn't know these things existed until recently, and I'm like, this is kind of intriguing. You're almost there. You're like right there.
That,
one more step.
Take that jump. Yeah. So I know it's funny to me, but anyway, so we relate to a lot of churches around here. We have good relationships with a lot of the churches around here. We're really good friends with Pastor Arnie over at Freedom Church, Pensacola, and they're wonderful. And we've done things together, from teachings to worship services, and to I think last year they actually hosted when we did a class. We had Dr. Hillel did a class last year on the parable of the sower, which was one of the better lectures I've sat through in recent years, and be praying for Dr. Hillel, those of you who are listening, because she's been dealing with some health stuff recently. So just be praying that she has a quick and speedy recovery and restoration of full health.
Recovery.
But so we have good relationships with them. We get invited. Rabbi Eric had church. I mean, when I say out in the middle of nowhere, like, please y'all remember we live in the mullet of Florida, so. 5 miles north of us is out in the middle of nowhere, Alabama, for the most part. There's like this grand open space between us and like Montgomery and Birmingham. And then, of course, Rabbi David and Rabbi Toby are over in Mobile, which is a little more populated, a little more civilized, I'll say. I'm not trying to pick at Alabama for being sparse, but it is very open, very agricultural, very rural. And we had a church call in. I mean, and they were like, "Can you come in and do a Passover teaching for us?" And so Rabbi Eric was like, "Well, where are you?" And the town they named, was out in the middle of nowhere. You get on the road, and he went and he taught, and they had a good time. They seemed to receive a lot from that. But we have the same thing here, and I know y'all do over in the Daphne Spanish Fort Mobile area. We've got a Baptist church here who wants me to come and do a children's Passover Seder teaching. Not a Seder per se, but teaching about the Seder, about the Passover meal.
So out of curiosity on that one, I know you had mentioned that this particular church is rather adamant of the KJV, the King James Version.
Very much so.
Is there an expectation for you to maintain KJV use?
That's a good question.
Not that's...
No, it's not bad. And, I grew up on the King James. I still have my King James Bible from when I was a child. So I actually kind of joked about that with Rabbi Eric in the office. I said, I need to go dig out my King James. Yeah. I know exactly where it is. I'll just teach out of that, because that's what they'll be used to. Yeah. And but I did kind of think maybe I could slip in a JPS Tanakh, just to
which isn't that far. Don't go with the modernized version. You go with the older version that was it 1917 JPS that uses very similar language.
Yep, and it's and that's largely the King James gets a lot of its stuff from the I forget, I don't know why the name is escaping me right now. The Hebrew translation with the vowel points. The Masoretic text. Thank you. Yeah.
I had to find it too.
I was like, where is that? How is that sliding around in my brain? But anyway.
Yeah.
So, and I know you had mentioned something about one of the bigger churches in your area inviting you to do.
Well, potentially, yeah. So, part of this whole conversation that we're having right now kind of is birthed from the idea of, which is something that's very important to both CMC and to Bradam, is I'm a huge proponent of unity in the body of Messiah before anything else.
Wholesale.
And for me, I look at most, not all. There are some churches, there are some denominations. Heck, even within Messianic Judaism, there are some synagogues that fall in this category that believe and teach things that are so far out there that I can't get on board with, right? But for the most part, Messianic Judaism is a part of the greater body of Messiah. And so Messianic Judaism, the church, for the most part, the things that we disagree on typically are not salvational issues, right?
Yeah.
And so for me, I care more about working together in unity for his kingdom, for God's kingdom, on the areas that we do agree on, which are salvational, than to split hairs constantly and be divided and working against each other because of the non-salvational issues that we disagree on. And so I have for years been extremely intentional on fostering relationships with pastors and churches in our area, which have given me unique opportunities, like you guys have experienced, to be able to do Passover Seders for churches, to have church staffs, like this church that I'll be meeting with the pastor for later today. One of their campuses, their entire pastoral staff came to our Passover Seder last year. Like They bought a couple of tables and came to our Passover Seder, and I did a Passover Seder for that campus's staff the year prior at their church. Just real informal, intimate Passover Seder just for them. So this is their flagship campus. They've got a bunch of campuses. It's a pretty large church. And so they're doing a summer theology teaching series on Sunday evenings coming up in the next month or so on the book of Exodus. And so my friend, who is a part of that church and teaches some of their stuff like that, some of their classes and all, is kind of spearheading some of this. And he approached me. He's like, hey, I think it'd be really cool if you'd be open to it, if you would come and teach some of this, like maybe teach about the Passover and the Exodus and things like that. If you're open to it, I'd love to talk to the senior pastor and see what he thinks. So I'm supposed to get together with him in a couple hours to talk about the possibilities of that, and what have you, kind of see flesh out what their thoughts are and where they're going with it. But I've had some really neat opportunities, not to get a platform. Like, my goal is not to get a platform at these mega churches or at any church. My goal isn't to go and teach on their stage or to preach in their Sunday services or whatever. Although that has happened some. My goal is to build relationships that we work together for the good of the kingdom. Because I think the body is pretty broken enough. Like, we don't need to add to it. I think we could do a far better job in building relationships. And then with that, you have unique kind of side effects where you start to have these conversations where people go, okay, well, the Shabbat stuff's kind of intriguing. Can you tell me a little more about that? Okay, well, we're learning about Passover. Can you tell me a little more about why that would even matter today? Like, I spoke at a buddy's church a couple of years ago, and there was a lady who was a relatively new believer that was there, and she came up to me afterwards, and I was preaching about the Passover right before Passover, and this lady comes up to me, relatively new believer, and she goes, but what difference did it make if Jesus was Jewish? Like, I don't understand why that even mattered. Like, what? So I got to have really cool conversation because these relationships are intentional, and we foster those and build them. And so I think that it's something that the Messianic movement as a whole could probably do a really better job at. I think some of us are really good at it, and others, I think we tend to kind of look to the inside. We kind of circle our wagons.
Shelter in place.
Yeah, sort of shelter in place, circle our wagons to kind of shield ourselves or whatever. And it becomes, even unintentionally, becomes an us versus them. But it's like Messianic Judaism, we can't separate ourselves from the church any more than we could separate ourselves from the traditional Jewish world. And so if we can't separate ourselves from it, and we shouldn't want to, but if we can't separate ourselves from it, we should absolutely work with the church. And like I said, there are very real issues, and I will not work with them. Like, I had oh man, this is probably going to get canceled. But I had a metropolitan.
Too late for that.
I had a metropolitan community church that number of years ago, maybe 8 years ago, approached me about Metropolitan Community Church, the MCC. It was one of the early pro-LGBT whatever denominations, like actual what is now called progressive Christianity. It was like the early phases of that. And there's the MCC still around.
Progressive Christianity before it was cool.
And so I had an MCC that asked me if I would come do a Passover Seder for their church, and I was like, that's probably going to be one I'm not going to be able to do. I'd let you come to our Seder, but I'm probably not going to go to your place.
Go on my face on your website.
But that was honestly, that was the first real, and there's been a few other things I've had to turn out, but that was the first real thing that I was like, this doesn't really fit what I'm trying to do here.
Yeah, like I think I asked Rabbi Eric one time, I was like, can I go to this event that this group is putting on? And he was just like, this was like several years ago when I first came here, and I was still learning my ways of navigating a lot of the, I guess the political side of ministry, we'll call it. And he was just like, I wouldn't go to that. And I was like, oh, like, it seems like a good event. And he was like, well, there's some names that I would, and over time, you learn about some of the things that certain people teach, and you're like, yeah, maybe good not to be caught there, end up on the Instagram, look, there's Rabbi Jonathan.
Yeah.
I, as someone who grew up in the church, I was called into Messianic Judaism when I was 25. So I grew up in the church. I'm not Jewish. It's interesting to be that. I know that's you too, Jonathan, Rabbi Jonathan.
Yep.
So here's what happened to me. So I grew up in the church. I'm not going to tell my life story. Grew up in the church and got saved in the church. The substance, as we know, is Messiah. If I had to pick anything, if I had to choose the Messiah over my talit, the Messiah over my kippah, the Messiah over Torah service, I would choose the Messiah every time.
Which shouldn't even be an option.
It's not an option. And that is what we have in common with the church, is the substance that matters. The thing about it is, though, is that I got saved. Church became really stale. And even when I was seeking the Lord, I could not draw anything out of the church. And that was around the time that God brought Messianic Judaism before me. And when I went to a Messianic congregation for the first time, after that day, August 27th, 2005, you would have to kill me to keep me from Messianic Judaism, because I know God called me into it. Now, I think there's a problem. I think the biggest bridge burners, I said the biggest, doesn't mean they're all. I think the biggest bridge burners between the church and the Messianic community are these overzealous non-Jews in the movement that are called out of the church oftentimes. And because they're called out and God is revealing these things to them, they become so hostile towards the church and what they grow up. We were robbed. That was a big thing, a big statement. I was robbed. I was robbed. Maybe not. Maybe you weren't robbed. How do I know that? Because I was one of those non-Jews that was overzealous with not enough knowledge. In 2005, I feel sorry for anybody in the church that was around me at the time. My best friend, the girl I was dating, I didn't marry her, but that was the Lord.
Yeah.
And she was wonderful. It was actually, not getting too into my life, but
vaguely threatening.
No, she was a wonderful young lady, but it just wasn't the Lord. Yeah. And Messianic Judaism was the reason. I mean, ultimately we had that conversation. But what I'm saying is that she was very plugged into her church, and she did not know what to do with what was happening in me.
Yeah.
And I heaped all kinds of criticism on the church. And her dad was a pastor, and I was, if I could, the me now, 42, talking to the me 25, I would have said, dude, chill out. You're being a jerk.
Yeah.
And
I've had those moments.
I had to say I was sorry to quite a few people. I even still, my best friend I still stay in touch with, we're still best friends. He lives in Washington State. And I still say, man, I was such a bonehead during that time. I believe every bit of what I was doing then now, but it was what I was doing when I was 25 was not shaped by grace.
Yeah.
Now, so that's a problem on the Messianic Jewish side. David talked about circling the wagons. Rabbi David talked about circling the wagons. It's a problem when the Messianic Jewish people circle the wagons and say, well, non-Jews or the church has the church and they're happy with that, so let them be. No, we should still keep it open, because look at what God did to me. Look at what God did to you. God calls us out of that.
Yeah.
But he doesn't call everybody out of that. And that was my problem. My problem was like, everybody should be doing this. And I was like, I wish I could slap myself back then. The other problem is when I had a conversation with a guy at a store who was in a church, and he said, so man, where are you going to church at? And I said, well, I go to a Messianic synagogue. Well, what's that? And I said, what's a Jewish synagogue that believes in Jesus? Believe in the whole Bible. I always say we believe in the whole Bible from Genesis to Revelation, whole Bible.
Yeah.
And I said, we just, we worship on Shabbat on Saturday and do these things. And then he goes, well, I don't think it matters how you do it. Now, that's a problem too.
Yeah.
That's a problem too. The thing is, though, is that you can't, Messianic Jews, it's mostly Gentiles though. Messianic Jews and non-Jews mainly have got to chill out and not heap curses over someone who's doing Christmas and going to church on Sunday.
Yeah.
And the church also needs to open their mind. And you know what? That doesn't mean they're going to be called into Messianic Judaism.
Yeah.
Because, you know, and because I've met I've known Messianic Jews that have had problems with Paul.
Yeah.
The Apostle Paul.
Yeah.
Because they're like, oh, you know, and I'm just like, listen, if I'm in ministry and it's tough enough, I would not want to deal with what Paul was dealing with.
Yeah.
You know? And Paul says things, you're listening to one half of a conversation, you don't have what their letter said.
Yeah.
So you take these verses and you say, well, you see, Paul says we don't have to do any of that stuff. It's not important.
Yeah.
And I'm like, no, what you're doing is you're being narrow-minded and you're not taking the full Scripture into account. But, you know, of course, culturally Jewish people have gate-kept those things and said, well, we're Jewish. That's our stuff.
Yeah.
So there's this problem, and the only bridge is Yeshua.
Yeah.
The only bridge is Jesus, Yeshua. But that's the two problems I've seen. And as someone who's been in both camps and has been part of the problem, being a Messianic Gentile who was a total jerk, you know, because I had all zeal and no knowledge.
Yeah.
So that's just some other things I'm throwing into the conversation as problems.
Yeah.
You know.
You bring up an interesting point, and that's the hyper zeal that sometimes you end up finding in certain individuals within Messianic congregations, and it made me think about it, and it's random, but it made me think about the fact, you know, there's a joke that says you never have to, you know, wonder who's a CrossFitter or a vegan because they're going to tell you the moment you meet them, right? And that's funny to me because for about 5 or 6 years I did CrossFit, 4 or 5 days a week. I was in the gym, 6 o'clock, 6:30 in the morning, busting out whatever the workout was, and I would constantly, I'm so sorry. I'd be at the coffee shop. I'm so sore. I did CrossFit this morning, and this is our workout, and and like, you know, and then you get into conversations and people are like, oh man, you do CrossFit, man. I don't know how you do. Oh, it's not that bad. Look, it's manipulable. You know, whatever the workout is, there are variations. If you can't do this, and you start to like try to preach people into CrossFit, like, and it's not that anybody's telling you it's just you get so excited about it. You get so so zealous. Like this is. I still, if it wasn't for the fact that at the time that I left the gym that I was at, the only reason I left is because CrossFit ain't cheap, bro. At all. Like it is not cheap. And at the time, like my wife and I were in the process of trying to sell our house, and we were trying to buy something else, and so I needed to reallocate those funds to do some of the goals that we had that we were trying to do for our family. And so I stopped going to CrossFit because it was just impractical expense wise.
So did you have to become a vegan? So
exactly. I had to make up for the zeal somewhere, but no. But the reality though is you get that same mentality, and I see it all the time with new people coming into a Messianic congregation, and you're right, it is typically Gentiles that are coming from the church that are, you know, like you said, they feel like the church lied to them and fed them a bunch of garbage and whatever, which maybe there's some validity to some of the feelings, but we oversimplify it through our what we think is righteous zeal that just becomes angry, vindictive zeal
and condemning.
I constantly tell people it's my rule that if you're new and the doors are on and I notice you, like I notice that you are new, you are a visiting face, like I do my best to get to you and talk to you at Oneg after service because I want to hear you talk and how you talk about certain things.
Keywords.
And be
keywords that you listen for.
I want to listen. I want to be like, okay, so who are you? How are you? Where do you come from? You know, welcome. We're glad to have you. And
who are you? How are you?
Who are you? How are you?
Where are you from?
Where are you from? Because
who, what, when, where, why?
It's not so much that like I'm worried. I just want to be able to get a firm footing with different people on where they're coming from. Because I've had people who walked in one time and then had a conversation with them and they never came back again. Just because I'm very quick to disavow sort of the things that lead to like hyper anger, zeal, this vindictive attitude towards Christianity and the church, and because a lot of times the people that exist in those camps. They come from places where they're listening to people who really shouldn't have a voice anyway.
Yeah.
But in the wonderful modern age of YouTube and the internet, they're able to speak all sorts of nonsense,
so much garbage quickly.
And they just there's no tampering. There's no. We're about to do a course, a book study on discipleship here at Bradom. And one of the questions I was going through to that the book asks, and that we're going to discuss when we get to it, is, we see what the disciples did in the days immediately following the ascension, and even several decades after that. Why is it today we seem to not have this effect? And part of that answer is because we don't have disciples. We have a lot of people who know a lot of things, but we don't have. You can know a lot. You can be, it's why
knowledge doesn't equal transformation.
Knowledge does not equal transformation. And I've told people, look, you need to be discipled. You need to be under someone who is going to train you up and bring you up, and with spiritual maturity, with help you to walk in the fruit of the Spirit. Yep. That's one of the reasons why, and we've mentioned several times in this podcast, the Mars Hill. Rise and Follow Mars Hill podcast, which is really good if you get a chance to listen to that. That was one of the biggest problems with the leadership in Mars Hill, was that there was no he refused to be under anyone, any kind of discipleship.
And they thought they did everything right.
They thought they did everything right, and and that's what people come with, this anger. I've listened to a couple people on YouTube now who told me something that was slightly different, and it seems right because it lines up with some of the verbiage of the English translation of the Bible that I like to read, produced by some nondescript person on the internet in Ukraine.
Or it's usually South Africa.
Or South Africa. So, one of these countries that and it's like, okay, man, you need to, brake pedal this before you end up in a really difficult place. Because I think a lot of people, even some of the newer people here at Bradom, would probably be shocked if they knew how good of relationships we have with the local churches.
I talk about it all the time at CMC.
Yeah,
and it can't be this. It can't. Just to say, it can't be this view of. Those poor church people, they're doing all this stuff that's not in the Bible and this, that, and that. It can't be that attitude. It's got to be, we are co-laborers, we are co-heirs. And just to say, and everything, and I was not, when I first got into the Messianic movement, nothing was underwritten in love initially. And I remember our rabbi at the time, I lived in Macon, Georgia, and our rabbi was sick. And the pastor of the church we rented gave the message, and I refused to really listen to him. I just sat there.
You're not the rabbi.
Not just because he was this preacher from the church.
Oh,
and
gotcha.
Man, and I know this guy. Over the years, I got to know this guy because that was when I first started going there. And over the years, I got to know this guy, and this guy loved God.
Who the heck are you?
On fire, filled with His Spirit. Couldn't talk about Yeshua, couldn't talk about Jesus and the cross without weeping. This guy was the real deal, and I was missing it, man, because he wasn't wearing a talit. That's a problem, man. And now, I regularly listen to he's again blessed memory, Pastor Charles Stanley. I listen to him regularly, so I know God has matured me by His grace to that degree, because in fact, I just was telling Rabbi David, the pastor of the church that rents from our synagogue, I listened to him this past Sunday, and he's fantastic. Yeah. And this isn't something recent for me. I'm just saying that I'm thankful that God was patient with me being such a bonehead.
Yeah.
And I was so critical of my fellow family in the church, and I just... I just want to, for me, it's important that the Messianic movement doesn't look at the church as like this second tier.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or an enemy, which I think some do.
Some get real. I was going to real quick, unless you have your thought already. One of the reasons why we like to see, and I want to see specifically Messianic Judaism remain in that space of, in the Talmud, it's called, be as the disciples of Aaron, which is constantly making peace, brokering peace, even between people who may not want peace with each other.
Right.
Because, we're the ones who, outside of secular scholarship, have been bringing to the forefront of the world, Christian and Jewish, the Jewishness of Messiah. That, because there's a lot of Christians who could have always told you that Yeshua was a Jew, Yeshua was Jewish.
Yeah.
But up until probably the 60s or 70s, and it really kind of birthed out of secular scholarship, not theological scholarship, was just how Jewish Yeshua was. It was these secular scholars, atheists, some of them, who really looked, who took the New Testament through a non-biased lens and were like, dude, this guy's a Pharisee. Like this guy is a religious Jew of the first century, Second Temple period, and then it kind of, like, there's some let's say fringe pastors, not fringe in like the unhealthy way, but like pastors and Christian theologians who were willing to embrace that at first, but it was always a fringe thing, and it wasn't until Messianic Judaism really took that on, and even then there are still some segments of Messianic Judaism that don't. There are some factions within Messianic Judaism that continue to look at Messiah as very Christian. We're getting rid of Judaism. We're getting rid of parts of practice. We're keeping Passover, Seder, and Hanukkah, but we're getting rid of a lot of the other religious day-to-day life practices that Messiah would have even himself participated in. And it's been sort of the healthier segments of Messianic Judaism and secular scholarship that have been bringing those forward, and I would like to see Messianic Judaism continue to embrace that and bring that to the church, bring that image of who Yeshua really was, what his life would have actually looked like. He wasn't the barefoot hippie, running around the hills of Judea with his teenage disciples. No, he was, there. He would have looked. We always in movies and stuff dress up the Pharisees like these very elaborate, and I don't think Yeshua would have been as elaborate. But it talks about him having nice clothes, a seamless garment. That is a well-made, a beautiful garment, not like the sackcloth of the field kind of thing that we normally picture them wearing. With tzitzit, hanging that were clearly distinguishable from the garment because they were able to be reached out and touched by the woman with the issue of blood. People even asked before, we had Foundations question one time. People were like, would Yeshua have worn tefillin? And I'm like, well, archaeology seems to suggest that they had tefillin back in the day. They were much smaller, and on more like string, not the big leather thongs that wrap the big boxes around the hand and the forehead. But religious men, it's presumed would have worn them all day long. So I have no reason to believe that Yeshua wouldn't have worn them.
And that's the reality of it, is that for all intents and purposes, Yeshua was a Pharisee, right? I mean, and we try to dance around that. We try to make Yeshua so countercultural that he didn't fit in any camp, and he was. But for all intents and purposes, he was a Pharisee. In fact, when we see the Pharisees come to Yeshua complaining about his disciples not washing their hands, right? He doesn't say, hey, Yeshua, the Pharisees don't say, hey, Yeshua, why didn't you wash your hands before you eat? And he didn't say, why do none of your disciples? He says, why do some of your disciples not do this? Why? Why was that even a question? It's because not all of his disciples were Pharisees. They came to him from other sects. Some of them were Pharisees. And some of them were very distinctly followers of John out in the wilderness being weirdos before. It's from the Chosen. One of my favorite things is Creepy John. Good old Creepy John. But
is that Chosen?
Yeah, the Chosen, But the reality is Yeshua was a Pharisee. He wasn't a Nicodemus ranked, high-ranking official of the Pharisees, level. But he was a Pharisee, and we know this from a number of things, but particularly the fact that he went to synagogue. And it specifically says in the gospel, as was his custom or his tradition, only the Pharisees went to synagogue. That was a Pharisaic structure, a Pharisaic concept. And I think the reality of all of this is that, and I talk about this with people coming into our congregation from time to time, is there seems to be what I describe as like a 1 to 2 year cycle that new non-Jewish believers coming from the church into Messianic Judaism goes through. And I think Rabbi Toby kind of hit the nail on the head when he was describing some of his experience in what I'm talking about. It's like, you have people that come in, and it doesn't matter how many times I try to warn people against it, they still end up walking it out and then cycle around again. But you come in and you're like, oh, this is great. This is exactly what I needed. Like, I was studying the Word on my own, and I felt like God was saying there was still something to these Moedim, these appointed days, and you guys are doing this is great. And they come in and they're excited and they want to know more. And then as they learn more, they start to go, wait, but the church has always lied to me. Why did the church always lie to me? How could they do that? And they get hurt and they get upset. And then that hurt becomes anger and aggression at the church, because the church is this entity on the other side of the tracks that's just evil, and they're steering people away from God, and they're taking people away from the Word, and da-da-da. Yeah. And then eventually, a year to 2 years later, depending on the individual and the humility of their heart, a year to 2 years later, they eventually will come back around to, all right, the church ain't so bad. There were some things they taught me that was wrong, but that's okay. I mean, it was a little thing compared to the way I blew it out of proportion.
Sure.
Yeah.
And it seems like almost everybody goes through this cycle, and it doesn't matter how much you try to warn them, they're going to process through it, right? It's kind of like the stages of grief.
Yeah.
Like, you can tell people the fourth stage is this.
Yeah.
They're still going to get there, and they're still going to go through it.
Running a marathon, it's like it's going to stink in the beginning, but then you get that runner's high, and you'll start, and the endorphins start rushing, and you're just like, okay, well, finally.
Or when you're doing CrossFit, and you're
So I don't know. I don't know. Like, I would say the same thing about vegans, but I don't know about any joy that comes from some of the vegan food. I'm kidding. There actually is a lot of good vegan recipes out there. I enjoy some of them.
And the thing, though, to all of this, in order to have those relationships, the healthy relationships, because Messianic Judaism we are to some degree kind of other. Right, we're part of the greater body of Messiah, but we are still kind of, for lack of a better way of wording, a niche market, if you would, right? Like, you're not going to have a 4,000 person Messianic synagogue in the U.S. It's just not feasible. I mean, God could make it happen, but it's not going to work the same as like the mega church down the street with all the lights and the shows and everything. No. Like, it's just not going to happen that way. But the reality is that the Messianic movement should be a bridge between Judaism and the church, but more specifically between the church and the Jewishness of their Messiah.
Yeah.
And if we are, as Messianic Judaism, holding the church at arm's length, or we're acting like everything the church does is wrong, or we're doing nothing but talking bad about the church, we're never going to bridge that gap. And the only way that we can truly bridge that gap is if we learn what true biblical love is, right? Because love is what paves the way for that gap to be bridged. Love is what opens up those doors. And when we talk about the intentional relationships that we build with pastors and churches in our area, that's what we're talking. It's that love. And to that end, I can't recommend highly enough. Rabbi Toby's listened to a few of them with me driving back and forth to Bradam to record Messianics. But one of my really, really, really close friends is Rabbi Jacob Rosenberg at Adat Tikva in the Chicago area. They're in Deerfield, Illinois, technically, which is one of the suburbs of Chicago, but they're in the Chicago area, and they're doing is one of the brightest minds I know of in Messianic Judaism. His father was the rabbi that I served under as rabbinic intern in New York, and him and his wife are really close friends of mine and my wife, and his brothers are good friends of mine as well. As one of his brothers is a rabbi out in Seattle, Messianic rabbi in Seattle. But Rabbi Jacob is doing a really insanely good sermon series, and it's a year-long sermon series on the biblical concept of love, very literally starting all the way back in Genesis and working slowly week by week through the concept of love through the Bible. And so I can't recommend it enough, and I'll put in the show notes, I'll put the link for their sermon podcast in the show notes for this episode so that you can go listen to it. But it started back in November of last year, and it'll run through sometime around this November, December. And he's just now getting into Matthew as he's been working through this. But I can't recommend it enough, especially in how powerful the imagery of what the description of godly love truly is and not just how we receive God's love, but how we relay that to others, right? We always talk about the two greatest commandments are love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself. And I always say we can't do the latter without the former. Like, we've got to learn to love God and learn to receive his love. Sometimes we feel like we aren't worthy to receive his love. Like, we know theoretically and esoterically it's there, but we just don't know that we're worthy of it. And so we still don't really grasp that sometimes.
Yeah.
But we have to love him and receive his love, and through that then we can love our neighbor as ourselves. And the truth is, the same is true. Like, love your neighbor as yourself. Far too many believers don't love themselves.
No.
Right? And you can tell that by the way we live our lives, by the way we take care of ourselves, by the clothes that we wear, by the foods that we eat, by the people we hang around with, by the activities that we favor, how are we supposed to truly love the Lord our God and receive his love and love our neighbor as ourselves if we don't actually know how to receive his love or think we're worthy of his love, and we don't know how to love ourselves? How are we supposed to do that? Yeah. And so he's working through this biblical concept of love. And I mean, it's just been a phenomenal series. I cannot recommend it enough, but I think he hits on some of those notes. And he's one of the messianic minds that has kind of opened my eyes up to a few things that we have done differently over the years. He had this brilliant idea, and I'd love to have him on the show one day, but he had this brilliant idea a few years ago that it was a God idea. Like, it was definitely a spiritual download thing. But he had this idea a couple of years ago as the High Holy Days come around, because in Judaism, we talked last episode about the Shalosh Regalim, the pilgrimage feast, right?
Yeah.
Well, there's no temple standing, so the Shalosh Regalim are not viewed as like high ranking as Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah are.
Sure.
And Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur become the quote-unquote High Holy Days of Judaism. Everybody goes to synagogue for them, and we're focused on repentance and whatever. And so he had this idea, like in Christianity, you have your 2-year Christians that go to church on Christmas and Easter. In Judaism, you have your 2-year Jews. They go to synagogue on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. So he had this idea, we're supposed to reach the Jewish people, right? But as a Messianic congregation, he has a very similar vision to what we do, which is that the only way that successfully works is with Gentiles involved, right? Because as a Jewish person, my primary objective is not to reach the Jewish people. As a synagogue, a Messianic synagogue, yes, our objective is to reach the Jewish community with Master Messiah. But as a Jewish individual, my primary objective is still what Isaiah says, to be a light to the nations. Yeah. And the nations coming into our congregation, their primary objective, as Paul says, is to drive the Jew to jealousy for his God. Mm-hmm. And so it's a cyclical reality, but in order for that Messianic synagogue to effectively minister to Jewish people with the promised Jewish Messiah, it requires those of the nations who have come to know the Jewish Messiah to drive them to jealousy for their Messiah. And so he had this idea, well, High Holy Days is the one time a year that everybody that's Jewish shows up to synagogue. What if, instead of it just being our synagogue doing our service, what if we invite churches to participate with us in this? And so they reached out the first year to like 2 or 3 churches, and they had some that came on, and they had a worship team that was compiled of people from their synagogue and people from the churches, and they actually had one of the church's worship leaders be the worship leader for the service. And they had over the years they developed a choir that led the liturgy together, and so they taught these people from the churches the High Holy Day liturgy and stuff like this, and all this. And so what they started doing was these churches, the first year it was like 2 or 3. The second year it was so successful that the second year they had 15 churches involved. Wow. And they rent from a huge church, so they've got the space for it. But they had, I think it was like 15 churches involved. And what they did was they were telling everybody, hey, when you're at work and you come across a Jewish person that you work with, say, hey, Rosh Hashanah's coming. I'm going to, like, these are church people that don't know anything about it, right? I'm going to this really cool synagogue for Rosh Hashanah. Would you come with me? Because I'd like you to, like, explain to me what's going on as we're going through this. Like, I've never been through it. It'd be cool if we could do this together.
Yeah.
And so you very literally had these Gentile believers from these churches that were participating in this Messianic synagogue's High Holy Day services that were driving Jews to jealousy for their God. That they ended up having something like, I want to say it was like 300 or 400 first-time visitors.
Wow.
Over the course of that second year, just the second year, the second year of doing this. They had like 300 or 400 they do it. Yep. Wow. They had like 300 or 400 first-time visitors. 50% of those were Jewish.
Wow. Wow.
And of those, something like 50% of them gave their heart to the Lord and became followers of Yeshua, because it was literally Jew and Gentile working together in this message. But it all began with love, not looking at the church as a gimmick. Oh, we're going to bring them in and we're going to do this Gentile reaching Jews thing. It's not a gimmick. It's very literally, we're doing, and he didn't go to these churches to go, hey, you should stop your Sunday stuff and your Christmas, Easter, and come participate with us. He went and said, hey, come participate with this event. You keep doing your thing, we'll keep doing our thing. We have a purpose, but let's work together for the glory of the kingdom of God above all else. And so we actually stole the idea a few years back. It happened that Shavuot, we just talked about Shavuot in the last episode. It happened that Shavuot fell for all of Judaism, whether you were counting in the Pharisaic or the Sadducean way. The
audacity,
the count for the Omer started on the same day that particular year, which meant that we were all celebrating Shavuot on the exact same day that year. But that Sunday that Shavuot fell on that year was also oddly the same day that the church was celebrating Pentecost. And so the entire body of Messiah was going to be celebrating the events of Pentecost together in unity without even realizing it. And so the Lord gave us a vision at CMC to call churches together. And so somebody gave us the money to rent out the Civic Center in our area for Shavuot. We didn't have a Shavuot service at our synagogue. Instead, we had this big joint Shavuot Pentecost service with a whole bunch of churches in the Civic Center, and had like 600 people come out, and we had like 4 or 5 churches involved. And it was this huge thing, and it was really awesome. And we had people leaving that were talking to people from our congregation. One of our ladies, Jennifer, one of the ladies that plays violin on our worship team, she comes up to me, she goes, Rabbi, she goes, I keep having people telling me they've never felt the power of God like this before. It's crazy. It's like, oh, that's awesome. Praise God. And she goes, no, Rabbi, I don't get it. I was like, what? She goes, this is what our service feels like every Shabbat. How are they living if this is the first time they've ever felt this? And I went, I don't know. Like, I don't have words for that, but I hadn't even factored it that way yet. And she's going, how we experience this every week. How are they not accustomed to this? But I brought up Rabbi Jacob Rosenberg's message because I think it's important. Highly recommend go listen to that sermon series, because it's important if we're going to bridge that gap, if we're going to have these relationships with the greater body the way we need to, Messianic Judaism reaching out, and it's going to have to be Messianic Judaism reaching out. It's few and far between that it's the other way around.
Very rarely.
But if we're going to have those relationships and reach out, it needs to come from a place of legitimate, heartfelt, Messiah-centered love for the kingdom of God first and foremost. It isn't about, like Rabbi Toby has said, it isn't about trying to fix anything that's in the church that we may deem as wrong or incorrect or not the right way to do things or whatever. It's not about trying to fix anything. It's about fixing the world through the kingdom of God. And that takes the body of Messiah as one, right? There isn't a Baptist body. There isn't a Pentecostal body. There isn't a Catholic body. There isn't a Protestant. There isn't a Messianic body. There is the body of Messiah. There's the bride of Messiah. When Messiah comes back, he's not coming back for a Presbyterian bride and a Episcopal bride. And he's not coming back for this harem of different denominations. He's coming back for a bride.
Harem
the body of Messiah, right?
Oh my gosh.
That may be the best wording I've used yet.
The harem of denominations. Oh my gosh, that's we're gonna have to use that from now on. That goes hand in hand with the Purim spiel message that you had given years ago.
I think so many people get on Facebook and stuff in the Messianic movement, or they get on Facebook, or they go on these diatribes, and they think they're going to fix that problem with one diatribe on Facebook or something. And where I feel like what the Lord's told me is like, hey, why don't you let me, when I come back, fix some of these issues that may or may not even be issues you think they're issues. Maybe they're not issues, but if they are, why don't you let the Messiah, when he returns, actually come back when he rules the world, and everybody will listen to him.
I had a friend of mine who wrote a song, and towards the end of the song, he actually says that he's like, he's not singing it, he's like rapping it. He's like, and if we don't get it all right now, and I'm paraphrasing, but he's like, if we don't get it right now, he'll just correct us when he comes back.
That's going to be all of us too, right?
Yeah, that'll be. I'm sure there's many things that we have not correct.
Yeah, I used to really hate when over the years, I've been a part of 3 Messianic congregations in my time, and every year, and you know what I'm talking about, it's always the high holy days. We get visitors. Mm-hmm. We get a ton. And I will say, a lot of these people, you will never see them again.
Yeah.
And I used to think, okay, so I guess I'm in a terrarium, and all these people from the church are, let's go see what the Jewish people do.
Yeah.
And I used to hate that. And it used to get on my nerves. And what God tells me is, hey, that was you at one point, right? Why don't you cool your jets, man?
Yeah.
Like, they're coming to see what you're doing. You weren't coming to a Messianic congregation back in 2005 because you knew I was going to call you into this. You went because you wanted to check it out. Let them check it out. What's wrong with you, Yeah. And so, that used to rise up in me. I'd be like, oh, all these people are here just to watch us do our thing, and God's like, yep, just like you did. And
I want people to watch.
Yeah, I want people to come see. Right, that's where I'm at now. Yeah, that's where I wasn't.
Yeah, like I love when some of the college professors will send their students for like the religions class, and they have to pick something other than what I guess they're used to. And sometimes we have 3 or 4, sometimes we have like 8 to 10 college students that'll come. And if I know they're there, I will purposefully, and people might get a little irritated with me. I hope not, but I slow down. Mm-hmm. Especially, like I know there was one time Rabbi Eric was out of town, and so I had the service, and I purposefully slowed down parts of the service to explain because I knew they were in the audience, and it's like there's like 10 of them, so I'm like, okay, I would not be doing my due diligence if I did not explain why do we do a Torah procession? Why do we read from the Torah? Why do we read from the rest of Scriptures? Because there's a lot of churches who do not read from Scripture. I mean, except for the pastor quoting a couple verses during his message. A lot of time you just don't have an entire section of the service dedicated to the reading of allotted portions of Scripture. Why do we say some of the prayers and blessings we do? Why do we wear some of the clothing we wear?
Right.
So, and those are things that I want.
Because it'd be really weird if we showed up to synagogue naked.
It's funny. Back to that harem of denominations. I have run across groups online where they were like, and this is really weird, maybe not child friendly, but they were like, oh yeah, nudity, like we should totally embrace that. Like we should. I was like, bro. Like they're like, yeah, it's all about getting. And I've had people like, it's all about getting back to the garden. I'm like, there are parts of the garden we should not be trying to get back to necessarily.
Well, even at that, we should probably get rid of this sinful nature before we try to go back to the
right. Point. Yeah, or else, might run into the sword of the cherubim. So, I am. Anyway.
Just because we've been redeemed doesn't mean we're ready for the garden yet. There's still work that needs to be done.
Yeah, it might be kept out.
Yeah, so that's the reason why we got kicked out. Yeah.
But yeah, so anyway, we're not perfect. We don't have all the answers, but we are definitely still looking to try and make as best as we can our relationship with the world. And not in the sense of like loving the world, like, we're told not to love the world as it is, but we're trying to make the world the footstool of God, the place where Messiah's kingdom reigns. Mm-hmm. And
that's not just something that's going to be done by the Messianic movement. It's going to be done by all of us.
All hands on deck, as they say.
And I think there are people in the church that are, I don't think, that's stupid. I know there are people at the church that are walking with the Lord just as much as any of us are, if not better.
I was about to say some of them better.
Yeah, some of them better, and some of them making much greater strides in regards to bringing the message of Yeshua to the world. So anyway, we're glad y'all could join us today for this conversation. We hope it's been a blessing, whether you're going to work or just sitting at home, and we will see y'all next week.
Thank you for listening to the Messiantics podcast. Make sure to subscribe so you can be notified every time we drop a new episode. And be sure to follow and interact with us on social media at Messiantics Podcast.